First off, we do want you to understand that there are not a lot of ERP systems out there that are going to allow you to do what Sage Office Connector does. Some other ERP systems will lock down their systems because they want you to use their entry grids or their entry fields within the program. Well, Sage Office Connector frees your data from your system and allows you to utilize Microsoft Excel for both reporting and data input. Currently, we have over 3,000 customers that are currently adopted the Sage Office Connector solution, and with that, we have over 10,000 concurrent uses out in the wild. And from those numbers, you can tell that Sage Office Connector is a widely adopted solution, as many of our customers do take advantage of this technology. This next slide here will provide some context as to how Sage Office Connector works. What we have here on the bottom is your Sage 300 construction and real estate system and an Excel workbook at the very top of the slide. Office Connector has several different pieces, and with Office Connector, we can not only query information into Microsoft Excel, but we can also use Excel as a data entry screen. We have the ability to write information directly into Sage tables using Sage Office Connector. Sage Office Connector can also be used to create import files that can be fed into Sage. We also offer the financials component, which is an extension of the query module. And we do host a variety of complimentary webcasts on each of these topics, and I do have a recording of each of them. So if any of these topics strikes your fancy, put that request into the comment section and we'll follow up accordingly. So I first want to help you understand the way that your data is structured within your Sage 300 construction and real estate. Your data is stored in tables, data that's when your ERP system stores the data, it stores it in tables here so that we can perform a variety of functions on the data and still maintain the integrity. The real beauty of Sage 300 construction and real estate flows in the relational.
Marshall, I don't know if it's true for other people, but you're cutting out on me periodically, and I don't know if people have mentioned that in chat, or it could just be my phone, and so I can just call back. But I just want to point that out, that you cut out. I couldn't hear you.
Bear with me just a moment. Does it sound better now, James?
Oh yeah, you normally sound great. It's just that there periodically you cut out, and I don't know if it was just me or other people, but I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, I haven't had anyone identify that in the chat, but thank you for bringing that to my attention. I think it's the way my cord is situated here. So, one of the audience members said that I sound just fine to them. So thank you for the feedback there. But as I was saying here, your data is stored in these tables. So when we perform functions in Sage, such as invoicing a customer or paying a bill, the tables are going to be updated accordingly. And so when we run queries against your accounting system, we're going to be pulling the information from these data tables and formatting it as information so that we can, perform functions on that. And thank you for the feedback there. Appreciate that. And so when we talk about, pulling information from your Sage into Microsoft Excel, some people may be thinking about, oh, I can take an inquiry and I can export that into Excel. And that is not what we're talking about here today. The disadvantage of exporting an inquiry into Excel is that information will be static, which means that if you wanted to refresh that report, you would have to go back into Sage, export the inquiry again, and then reformat it appropriately. But what we're talking about here today with Sage Office Connector Query is much more advanced. We're essentially going to make Excel an extension of your Sage technology so that you can format and customize a report once, and then simply click a button to live refresh that with data from your Sage accounting system. And that's kind of how Sage Office Connector Query will operate. However, today, we're focused on Sage data entry. And so data entry with any ERP can be a tedious process. And when you were initially trained on Sage 300 CRE, your consultant probably taught you how to input data into Sage using the data entry screens within the program. And this is how the program was designed many years ago and how the programmers envisioned the end users would use the program. However, when we start to talk about managing large data sets, using the data entry screens can seem like a daunting task. To manage larger data sets, we do have the ability to use import functions within Sage. Most frustrations here stem around formatting the CSV file properly. Another option for data entry is to write values directly into the program using ODBC drivers. As a general rule, what you can write to the program you cannot import, and what you can import you cannot write, but there are exceptions to that rule. And so it's important to distinguish the difference between importing and writing when using the tool that we're going to be using today. Importing will create values or transactions in Sage, and writing will allow you to replace the information that's currently in Sage or the detail. And so we will be focused on importing values into Sage today. Here's a list of the types of imports that are available for Sage 300 Construction and Real Estate Office Connector. You can purchase just one of the import flavors. So whether you're just looking to import payroll time or invoices, you can buy just that feature, or you can buy the whole product set, which is much more cost effective. And so we will be looking at the licensing here in a bit later. And then with the Import Designer, we can actually create our own imports and take advantage of all that are available. And so with that introduction, we're going to go ahead and jump on into the software. And per today's agenda, we're going to start by looking at some of the Launchpad templates that are currently available for your Office Connector solution. When you install Office Connector, you will get a shortcut for the Office Connector Launchpad, and I went ahead and opened that up here. On the Welcome tab, you'll see lots of information regarding the Office Connector product, including the most recent Quick Aim reference guide, which you can see right here. Product information, updates, and other documentation are all readily available. But we can access the different template reports here under the different tabs, and today we're focused on the import. And so the couple import templates I wanted to show today were going to be the cost to complete and then the estimate one as well. And so there will be a disclaimer when you open up the different templates, and this is essentially saying that this report will create a live connection to your database, and we will be updating the information within Sage. But that's kind of the point of today's demonstration. But there will be a disclaimer basically letting you know that. Now, the Office Connector query works really well in tandem with the other features, and so we're actually going to be leveraging Office Connector query as well as Office Connector import for this example. For each of the Office Connector templates, you will get an information page, and as you can see here under the required software section here on the left-hand side, this is going to be utilizing the Jobcost application within Sage. And we're also going to be leveraging the query aspects of Office Connector as well as import. And we're going to be importing that to miscellaneous worksheets. What we're essentially going to do is write values to, or import values, I should say, to the miscellaneous worksheets within Jobcost. And that's effectively going to feed our cost to complete reports. And so if you are just getting started with Office Connector, you will want to read these information tabs before you get started with the templates. We'll next move over to the administration page, and this is allowing us to enter in a job number and as of dates and other information we want to return on this. I'm going to use some sample details today, so we'll go ahead and use those here. And this will give you more information provided to this. Now I'm going to put in a date here that actually matches my date within Sage. So we're going to put that, because I'm working with some sample data today, and we'll go ahead and refresh this report. So this is going to go ahead and populate our cost to complete report here on the next tab. And it's pulling the information from Sage to use the most up-to-date data. And so what we'll do next is enter in cost to complete information, and then that will allow us to turn that around and send that right back into Sage. Into the miscellaneous worksheet fields. And so here on the admin sheet, we can determine what miscellaneous worksheet fields that we're going to be importing these values to. Okay. And so it went ahead and finished that, and you can see the cost to complete worksheet that we have here now. Now keep in mind that if you were not necessarily the person responsible for determining the cost to complete, we could send this worksheet to someone else and have them enter in the cost to complete as well as different comments and then return it to us. And then we can invoke the import program to be able to send these values into Sage. We can see details on this, such as the project manager or other contacts on the particular job, and other details such as the job address and other information there. And we could come to this section here, and if you were responsible for entering the cost to complete, you could go ahead and enter those details here. As you can see for this first one, the estimate is $57,000 and change, and the job cost to date is $14,000. If I believe that the cost to complete is going to be another $50,000 because, you know, we're looking at a project overrun, then you can see here the over-under, and looks like we're going to be, you know, over 13% on that job. And so we could come over here and enter in a comment. Perhaps, you know, the supplier raised their prices. We can go ahead and enter those comments into the appropriate fields. We can work down the list of cost codes here, and I know that was just on coordination, but you could imagine that's on any of these sections down here, and it pulls in all of the cost codes for each of those sections. We'll then receive the total for the over-under once this has been complete, and then that'll let us know, you know, future projections on the job, so we can, you know well ahead of time if we think we're going to make money or not. We can then take these values and send them into the accounting system, and I could enter additional details here, but I'll just work with the first row here. This system has already been configured with an import program or an import feature within Office Connector. And they're actually buried here between column Q and W. And so if I went ahead and unhid this, you'll be able to actually see those import functions right over here for the different miscellaneous worksheets we'll be sending those to. And so when I come up to the Add-ins tab and click on the Send Values to Sage here, and go ahead, it'll trigger those import functions to go ahead and send those values into Sage. So we'll click Save Import File, and now this is prompting me, okay, we're going to save the import file. Where would you like to save it? Well, for today's example, I'm simply going to save that to my desktop. And so then what you'll do once you save the particular document is you can determine whether or not we'd like to go ahead and open up Jobcost and import the file. And so I currently have that selected as no action, but what I'll do here is I'll go ahead and launch Office Connector Import Miscellaneous Worksheets, which will basically open up Jobcost to allow me to import this file. So we'll go ahead and click OK here, and it's saying that it's going to default to the last import file used here, and that's the one on my desktop, which is what I want it to use. So we'll click OK. And so what it's doing now is it's going and saying, okay, here's the import file. Let's go ahead and import that. Now, when you do that, it'll go ahead and feed those values directly into Sage, invoking the import program, creating the miscellaneous worksheet transactions within Sage. And so here you'll watch that work in real time. And I just wanted to show that example here on one worksheet, and then we'll jump into some of the other examples in just a moment. James, anything you'd like to add based on what I've shown so far while it's working?
Only that this example is at the cost code level. Some people do forecasting at a category level. Some do it only at the job level. There are miscellaneous worksheet entries at any of those levels. And this information can be manually entered in Jobcost under task miscellaneous worksheets. In Marshall's example, he doesn't have to enter it. He's done it in Excel, and so it's without having to handle information again. It's being imported, into Jobcost. But it's the same as if you manually entered it and made no mistakes.
Yep. Perfect, James. And what I'm doing here is I'm just jumping into the Jobcost miscellaneous worksheets here. And I was just going to pull up that cost code there. And is this where I would see that? Or would I have to run a report to see that, James?
So if you create the entries, right? So they would have been created through new and posted, then they'll be in a transaction table and posted to current when they post, right? And then they would have been accumulated up. So this is a representation of the other way you would get data in if you manually entered it, that grid right there that you just showed. But a transaction type of report, or an inquiry of either the new or current, depending on if it's been posted, that would show the transactions created. So this is superior to writing in that there's transactions backing up the data in there. You have both, which conforms to accounting principles more solidly, as opposed to, say, writing. But entries, you could do all entries down there. If you go like that report, that would just like be an inquiry, and then they would either be in the new or history file, and so it posted it.
I believe it posted it. So
yeah, so those are in the new file, and if you look in the current file, once something's posted, then it moves to the current file, and the specific entries you're looking for are miscellaneous worksheet entries. And I'm the consultant, so I would be able to tell you right down there, there's miscellaneous worksheet entries. You could filter and only see those. Obviously, query could also do that. Notice that a miscellaneous worksheet entry can have a job, or a job in a cost code, or a job cost code in category. And all of those could be miscellaneous entry 1, right? Because there's up to 6 transaction types. And then you're seeing other transactions here, costs and things like that. You're seeing them in there.
What was the cost? I sent that under coordination. I was just coming in here to see if I could locate that under the correct item there, because we did import that in. But regardless, we'll go ahead and move on in the interest of time.
If I add work process, I've seen people do, rather than doing that in Excel and then going into the whole benefit of Office characters, you could do a lot all in one place. So if you were going to be writing from this workbook that Marshall was at into Sage, you could simply have a query that would query the new and current file to validate that what you wrote got in there. And you could just put it as part of that same workbook or a different one, so that, it's here, I click this, it now is in Sage. I should then be able to just refresh that. You'd see it reflected on that sheet he was on, but you'd also be able to see it in a query. So you could a query is like an inquiry, right? But it's right there in Excel. You can more quickly do it.
Yeah, that's a good insight there. That as soon as you're aware that you can query that information, you could check it a couple of different ways to ensure that it did it correctly.
Right.
So yeah, the next report that I wanted to show was on the job cost estimate. Many of our customers do their estimates in Excel. We have other customers that will use Sage Estimating. However, it's not uncommon. I believe our biggest competitor to Sage Estimating is Microsoft Excel, as many of our customers will use that for pre-construction or for estimates. And so it's a great idea to get those estimates into Sage, and so that you can use them kind of as a starting point for your budgets. And so this particular template here allows us to use the import functions to import these into Jobcost. And so we can come here and see the cover sheet. And I'm going to use some sample values here today. So we'll go ahead and use those here today. And whether you had a job set up or if you had a brand new job, we could go ahead and write that in to create said job. And so for the example I'll use today, you'll see the job number that it'll use is that 09-157. That job is not currently in my Sage, and so you can see here that it recognizes that, and it'll either return a job will be created or a job already exists. So we can use this template for creating jobs within Sage as well. You'll enter in the details on that job, such as the address information, the description on that job, any customer information and whatnot, and the estimating categories. That's going to go ahead and feed this estimate report here, which we are pulling in the list of cost codes from Sage, our standard cost codes, and then we're showing all of the different attributes that you would enter there. So whether you were performing that or if you were subcontracting the labor out, you could go ahead and enter those into the appropriate areas. If we were pulling in, production units, we could track that information as well. Because other times companies will budget based on production units. And so we can enter all of these details in here as appropriate. You can also break open these different categories on this particular one. So you can see these fields here will calculate the labor. We could either put in the labor amount, or we could put in the units of labor, whether that's 160 hours or perhaps a different unit that you're using for your labor costs. You could also calculate overtime amounts, as those will be calculated separately from your standard labor, as well as labor burden. And so we pull in all of these categories here as appropriate based on what we had entered on the cover sheet. So such as materials, subcontracts, or other categories that you're tracking. Once we've entered the appropriate details for each of the cost codes, we can come up to the add-ins tab and create the import file, and it will feed these into Jobcost to create those estimates. James, anything you'd like to add on this particular template?
Only that it effectively utilizes, query and import, so it will work. Sometimes people, as you mentioned, already have their estimates in a sheet, and they simply want to enable them to import, which you've already exposed the operational portion, the import function. You're going to talk about Designer. So whatever example we use, you'd be following the same example to import enable any of your workbooks. And the last thing is, when you import and you're importing to a new job, like if you're importing to an existing job, you could import approved estimate changes or original estimates unless you finalized your estimate, right? It's the same process as if you were in Sage. But on the cover sheet, there's certain data that if you create a job will get updated, but there's other information that you may find desirable when you create a job. And some people want to affect both on this one screen that Marshall's on, including ones that don't get populated when you import, when the job's created. You could write enable this. And to know more about that, we have presentations on write, and you'd simply be able to do both in one workbook. That's all.
Yeah, great points there. And yeah, like James was saying earlier, we could pull in like a list of jobs here or other information to verify against the information we had entered. I did receive a question into the chat box that I think is relevant at this point in time. Can import be used to import budgets? The answer is yes. I'll relaunch that one slide that I had provided earlier, and this shows the different imports that are available for Sage. And so you'll see that we can enter in the job cost estimates like I had shown here, and then we can also import GL budgets. So to answer your question, yes, we can import budgets. And so
Marshall,
thank you for the question. And
from a construction perspective, use the word budgets and estimates interchangeably. So what Marshall just explained was Sage-centric: estimates for job budgets and budgets for general ledger. If you were thinking of something else, for example, I want to stage my expected expenditures over time in job cost at the beginning of a job, and then track my cost relative to that, it would be related to his first example. That miscellaneous worksheet has the different fields, columns available for those kinds of additional budgeting concepts. And then finally, there's the budget concept at the job level that finance people think about. And we have if your folks are interested in seeing it at some point, you could mention it in comments, that it's a revenue cost forecasting or cost and dollars paid to be able to do that at the job level. So there's quite a lot more that we could do. We just have to focus on certain subjects in this presentation. So plant some seeds.
Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, we can do the budgets at the GL level. We can do them at the category level, the cost code level. Yeah, there's lots of different ways that we could, record those in Sage. And so what I'd like to do next is I'd like to turn it over to James for just a few moments. He had an example prepared, and correct me if I'm wrong, but was this on importing, you said invoices that you wanted to show?
Correct. Yeah, I'm going to use accounts payable invoices in my example, but AR invoices could also be imported. And once I share this, you should see accounts payable open on my screen. Marshall, if you could confirm that.
Yes, that's what I'm seeing.
Okay, great. So my objective here, because I'm using accounts payable, is I want to get in invoices that I would otherwise have to manually enter right here under enter invoices. And I'm assuming people attending know what that is, if you understand this. And there is an option for that And for every import except miscellaneous worksheets, there's options in each of the applications under import. So here, there's only one thing you can import into accounts payable, job cost. Marshall's already touched upon two things. And then you can import commitments as well. So, but import invoices, if I wanted to know more about what Sage had, then I could come right here under help and type the word import. You could do this in job costs and payroll, whatever, and you'll see a lot of different topics, including the file example of what an import needs to look like. So all of that's here, and that includes, like, if you're importing like direct cost or in accounts payable invoices, how retrieval, hierarchy retrieval would work. And I'm not going to go into all that because it's more than the scope of just our presentation, but rather than manually entering there, because it's too time consuming, Marshall already showed you there's a number of templates on the Launchpad, and they're nice starting points and they're all functional, but they're just potential starting points. So in one of your peers, their objective, of course, was to create an import file for accounts payable that looked like this. Now, even though the extension of this is TXT, and accounts payable is looking for a different extension, if you wanted your tools import, you could still say, pick this file and import it, right? But as long as you conform to the rules, and this is my objectives, but you mess up one of these columns, commas, and you've got a big problem and think about lots and lots of data. So the person I'm thinking of in my mind of customer, your peer, wanted to import invoices, and this is an example of the import for invoices that's on the Launchpad, which is interesting. She saw it during a presentation, and it describes here, just as Marshall said, what's required. This one doesn't require query because it's not doing validation. If it had query, then when I entered it was a valid vendor. But in this person's example, it's like, this is fine, but our distribution of invoices has more columns. I need more columns than that. And more than that, I have a lot of things I need to enter. Like, this is me manually entering it. There's a lot more lines there. There could be 240 lines or more. And I don't want to do this. It's tedious. She wanted a better way. And so, was there a better way? Yes, there was a better way. And the end result was actually quite simple. Marshall's going to show you the designer here in a moment, but this is ultimately, her data came to her in a CSV file, and there were columns. And in this particular person's case, their commitment that came from outside wasn't in the correct format for Sage, but she had a lookup in Excel. She could do a lookup of the correct one based on the one. So she had a formula right here. And so she had lots of lines, actually, thousands, by the way. And so all she had to do was put the respective formulas, the import formulas right here. And that's what the designer does, is it can put the formulas right next to it. So I just wanted to show you that you don't have to manually type things in. If you have the data coming from somewhere else, you can map it. And I would say way back to your example, Marshall, that you're about to do of the designer, because that's how they would do this. So you could take
and that sounds good. I'll go ahead and change that back to myself here. All right. And James, can you confirm that you can see my screen now? Should look like the Office Connector Launchpad.
I do. I see the Launchpad.
All right. And so, yeah, what James was referring to is one strategy that we can use for the designer. And the way that I describe it is there are two main strategies. And James was describing how we could come into the import wizard here, and we could pick a particular type of import, such as AP import invoice, and select next. We're going to do that for invoices. And we could select one or multiple of these columns. And as James said, there could be many, many more of these columns here. So we'll grab just a few of them here for the AP invoice. And then this is where you kind of have two different strategies that you could go. You could link these to a column in a cell. And so if you did receive information from an outside source, like James was describing, you could simply map the vendor to the appropriate vendor within Excel, and then continue to do that for each of the items. The advantage of doing that is that you could simply copy that down. And so if you had a long list of invoices, you don't have to, enter all those details over and over and over again. And so James was describing that first strategy. Now, the second strategy
with that person. That's correct. Perfect.
Yep. Perfect. Yep. And so the second strategy is a little bit different. And that's going to be to create an entry grid to select the columns. And so what we can do here is click Finish, and it's going to put it up in A1 because that's where my cursor is. So I'll click Finish. And it created an import function here in L2. And the other fields here are where I can enter in information, such as the vendor, the invoice number, description, and other details. Now, I would also recommend using data validation when setting these up, and you can leverage the query aspects of Office Connector to do so. I'm going to open up a brand new sheet over here, and I'm just going to type in vendor list right here, and we'll go ahead and pull in a list of those vendors using the Office Connector query. If you're familiar with Office Connector query, then you probably know that you can find AP vendors on the AP vendor table. And I'm going to pull in the vendor number and name today and go ahead and select Next and Finish. That should return all of the vendors that are currently in my solution, and I had it bring in captions as well. But then we can validate the list against this vendor list here. And it's very simple to do that leveraging Microsoft Excel. You can come to the Data tab and Data Validation, and then go ahead and select List, and then tell the program where that list is. For my case, it's on this next sheet, and we're going to just allow the user to enter in the number that's associated with that as well. So then we can use the drop-down to select the appropriate vendor right there. We could go a step further and modify this import here. I could add in a column here and call this, say, vendor name, and so that would, provide insight into what vendor we selected, because perhaps you don't know all the vendor numbers there. And so here we could remove the validation, which I'll go ahead and clear that first, select that to be any value. And then we'll come here and do a lookup function within Microsoft Excel or within Office Connector. And so that will allow us to look up a certain value based on a key field, such as the vendor number. We can go ahead and insert that, and it's asking the table that we're interested in. I'm going to select the vendor table here, and we'll go ahead and select Next. I'm going to reference whatever vendor is selected in A2. So I'll go ahead and put in $A2, and the $sign is an anchor field, and that's just Excel syntax. We'll select Next and indicate that we want to return the vendor name and Finish. So what that's going to do is whenever you select a vendor here, such as vendor 100, you could go ahead and put in the vendor name here. And now that I think about it, I could have gone the other direction and had, the vendor number equal whatever name I selected. And that would be very easy to set up as well. So just different strategies associated with that. And then if we were to, expand this table down a couple columns like that, then we could, select the appropriate one for each of these, and it'll fill those in for whatever vendor that we select there. We can then enter the other invoice details here, and then go ahead and trigger those import functions, which will create that CSV file that James had described earlier. So here's an example of a properly formatted import file, specifically the one I had created earlier for the Jobcost miscellaneous worksheets. So just calling out how it's going to make that, and we can use the import designer for creating our own imports. And we talked about the two strategies that you could go, either mapping it to fields that currently exist or creating an entry grid like you see here, to where we can start to enter in the details and leverage data validation and other Excel tools to help us make quick work of this. And so, James, anything you'd like to add to that example of using the import designer to create a grid?
Yeah, the only thing, this would all be covered in training. So training doesn't take a long time. They're like 90-minute classes, but take them. You can learn to do this. There's not a lot. This is not a training class, but when it comes to certain imports, there's just one really type of row, so it's pretty straightforward. Like a miscellaneous worksheet, the rows are the rows. It's just which miscellaneous worksheet you're creating entries for. An invoice has a hierarchy of an invoice and its distributions. And the way the formulas are created the distributions don't even have to immediately follow the invoice, but they would have to know which invoice they belong with, and the import program will figure it all out. So it just depends on what detail you're trying to get in, the approach you'd use, right? But if it's all there, and the example for the person I was talking to, they had a certain number of distributions. They could put them all in columns. So all of their import level for the invoice and the distribution were all in one row, but they could very well have been on different rows. It just depends on what your data is, right? What the approach is. Payroll time, same way, and pretty easy, relatively speaking. However, in that example, in most of these, the order you import is not all that important. It will figure it out. It will put it in the right order. But for payroll time, it can be very important because payroll has a hierarchy for retrieval of automatic overtime, for example. So you have to know something about your application when you're creating imports to different things. And that's all you ask your consultants, or you get a little help when you're thinking about what you want to do. It's all about streamlining so you don't touch information more than once. I guess maybe the only other thing is that we're talking so far about importing just one thing per like worksheet or a workbook, but you're not limited to that. You can have a workbook, and I see it a lot with payroll, that where someone imports time, they import miscellaneous worksheets, progress on the job, and sometimes equipment costs separate than their payroll because they want the equipment entries to have the date that goes into Jobcost is the date the equipment was used, not the period ending date, and they want control over that. And you could accommodate all of that with the technology that we're demonstrating here.
Yeah, that's a great example of how you can kind of really start to use your imagination to think about what's possible. And, you know, if we're importing the same value into payroll for a time entry as, you know, equipment usage, then, you know, the same number is being used. And so you could definitely see how that would be advantageous if we imported that, you know, with one click. So, no, great point there, James. And so with that, that is just about everything we had to show you today within the software. And so I wanted to thank everyone once again for joining us today, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your week.